Alors, bonsoir et bienvenue à la faculté de droit de l'Université d'Ottawa. C'est mon très grand plaisir de vous accueillir ce soir pour cet événement sur le raclage de données. Before I formally introduce this panel, which is titled Free for All, Data Scraping and the Public Interest, and introduce our moderator as well, I'd like to make a few acknowledgements. So first I'd like to acknowledge that this event is taking place on the unceded ancestral territory of the Anishinaabe people. I also acknowledge the support of the Alex Trebek Fund for Dialogue, which has generously supported both tonight's event and the workshop which will take place tomorrow on data scraping in the public interest. We're enormously grateful for this support, which has allowed us to bring together a great group of people to discuss an issue that we feel is very important but perhaps not sufficiently understood. I'd also like to thank the Center for Law, Technology and Society for its technical, administrative and moral support. In particular, thanks to the Center's director, Florian Martin-Bariteau, and his excellent team, which includes Danica Perrier and Nathan Hu, who's our videographer tonight. The video that's created tonight will be posted on the Center's website, and I'll tweet it out when it's available. I know a number of people have asked about it. So this afternoon we've invited you all to our public panel titled Free for All, Data Scraping in the Public Interest. The workshop flows from a grant that was received by Jon Penney, Pamela Robinson, and myself from the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council of Canada. This grant will be supporting our research into data scraping over the next 3.5 years. In a big data society and economy, data is becoming an increasingly valuable resource and one that's at risk of privatization and monopolization. Data scraping of publicly accessible websites is a means by which all kinds of actors, including corporations, startups, journalists, civil society groups, and academics acquire data, but there are many question marks around whether such activities are legal or ethical. Our panel tonight will jump into this discussion, and we hope that you will join in with us as well. So let me introduce the panel's moderator and turn things over to her. Pamela Robinson is an associate professor in the School of Urban and Regional Planning at Ryerson University and a registered professional planner. As part of the geothink.ca research team, Pam's current research and practice focus is the challenges and opportunities new technologies present to Canadian cities, with a particular focus on open government, smart cities, and artificial intelligence. She serves on Waterfront Toronto's Digital Strategy Advisory Panel and the Toronto Public Libraries Innovation Council. Pamela is also a columnist for Spacing magazine, where she writes about technology and urbanism. So without further ado, let me turn things over to Pamela, who will introduce our panelists and tonight's discussion.
Okay. Hi everyone, thank you so much for coming. So as you can see, we have 4 amazing panelists today. The way we're going to start the panel is that I've asked each of them to offer a few kind of brief opening remarks. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to introduce them, they'll do the remarks, then I'll come back to me and I'll introduce the next panelist. And so Yuan, we're going to start with you. Yuan Stevens, right to my right, holds a BCL LLB from McGill University, and they're passionate about patching out vulnerabilities in our legal and technical systems. Her interdisciplinary work focuses on the intersections of public interest hacking and normative systems as an obstacle or an enabler of self-determination. She is currently the research manager and project lead at the International Center for Comparative Criminology at the Université de Montréal, and the researcher for hacker expert for Gabriella Coleman at McGill University. She serves on the board of directors for Open Privacy Research Institute and has previously worked at the Berkman Klein Center for Internet and Society at Harvard University. Over to you to open up your opening comments. Thank you.
Perfect. So we're talking about data scraping, and we're talking about the ethics of it. And the question I would like to ask today is, to what extent is a law lagging behind on its governance of data scraping? And I am particularly curious about how the copyright law is used as a sort of band-aid solution to claims of wrongful data scraping, and how competition law, so anti-monopoly law, should be used perhaps more as a consumer protection law in the public interest, and how we need to maybe redefine supplies. That is the thing that is the basis of competition law in some ways, and how data can be seen as a sort of supply. And I'm coming from this as a person who is a baby data scraper as well as a legal scholar, and sort of person who thinks a lot about the philosophy of law, and legal history. So I'm curious about how I can learn from my fellow panelists and see where we can patch up flaws in the law, and learn best practices and share best practices as it relates to data scraping.
Great. And then our next panelist today is Max Hartshorn. He's a web developer and a data journalist for Global News. He helps journalists collect, analyze, and present data online in new and engaging formats. He also works with a product team to create new user experiences for globalnews.ca, which is the second largest news website in Canada. Max's main interest is in computer-assisted reporting, which he says is a fancy way of saying he likes to write and code. He's an active member of the Toronto developer community and has been a freelance contributor to numerous publications. He also volunteers at the Ryersonian student newspaper, which is at Ryerson University in downtown Toronto, where I teach, and helps students develop data journalism projects. Max, over to you to introduce yourself.
Okay, so thank you. So to introduce myself, I just thought I'd talk a little bit about the sorts of scraping that I do in my work. So we use scraping often to come up with new news stories. So an example could be a really simple consumer story. For example, last week I built a scraper to look through the Quebec and Ontario pot websites to see which province has cheaper pot. So I downloaded the different prices from each website, took an average. Turns out Quebec is much cheaper than Ontario. A more serious example, in the US, the Atlanta Journal-Constitution, they did a project where they built scrapers to grab information from grab healthcare disciplinary reports from all 50 states, and they took that, they compiled a database of over 100,000 healthcare disciplinary reports. Then they used a machine learning algorithm to filter out the reports that just dealt with sexual abuse, and they were actually they found a pattern of doctor sex abuse nationwide. It was totally overlooked, and they found that doctors were often committing sexual abuse and then being let off with really minimal punishments, and often being allowed to practice and sometimes going on to abuse again. So this is a big story when it came out. It was a Pulitzer Prize finalist, and it was enabled just by data scraping. So that's just an example of the sort of good work that can come out of scraping.
Great. Okay, our next panelist today is Jon Penney. John's an associate professor in the Schulich School of Law at Dalhousie University on the east coast of Canada, and also a research fellow at Citizen Lab, which is based at the University of Toronto's Monk School of Global Affairs and Public Policy. John is a research affiliate of the Center of Information and Technology Policy at Princeton University, and a research associate in the Civil Servant Society project at MIT Media Lab. His research lies at the intersection of law, technology, and human rights, with strong commitments to data justice and empirical and interdisciplinary methods. From the internet today to artificial intelligence and beyond, his work aims to understand the role of technology and data practices in public and private censorship, surveillance, and other emerging legal and regulatory practices, including how these impact people's rights, interests, and behavior.
Thanks for the really lovely introduction. So I guess I also should say a few words about, like my fellow panelists, where I come at this issue of data scraping, web scraping. So as you know from the introduction, I'm a legal scholar, but my doctoral research at Oxford was also interdisciplinary and empirical. And in that project and in more recent projects, I have done some data and web scraping. My doctoral research looked at regulatory chilling effects online, so how certain online regulations, online surveillance, online state and corporate activities impact people's behavior. And it turns out that publicly accessible online data sources provide one important way that you can measure those kinds of impacts. So that's something that was important to my research at Oxford. And it's also important to a more recent project that I'm working on today, which is a collaboration with colleagues at the Princeton Center for Information Technology Policy and the MIT Media Lab, where we're looking at forms of the impact of automated online enforcement. And our first sort of case study is looking at the algorithmic enforcement of copyright online. And in order to do that, again, we're using information and data that includes, for example, tweets on a social media platform to measure the impact that, for example, receiving a copyright notice might have on someone's activities on a social media platform. And in that context, it's forced us as researchers, so I forced myself as a researcher to think through research ethics, to think through how do you respect users, privacy, autonomy, as a research question. But also, it's forced me to think through these issues more generally. As a legal scholar concerned with human rights, how can we think through these issues within broader society? How can we do privacy? How can we do privacy law and policy better in light of some of these new challenges with web scraping and data privacy? So that's how I come at this issue. And like my panelists, I'm interested in having a great discussion on some of those bigger questions today, and hopefully we'll have some answers as part of our discussion.
That's great, thank you, Jon. And our last panelist today, who I'm super happy to introduce, is Bianca Wylie. Bianca is my friend, she's also a senior fellow at the Center for International Governance Innovation, and the co-founder of an organization called Tech Reset Canada. Bianca is an open government advocate with a dual background in technology and public engagement. She's been working for the last several years in the tech sector in operations, infrastructure, corporate training, and product development, and most recently at Thomson Reuters. As a facilitator at Swearin Inc., she designed, delivered, and supported public consultation processes for various governments and government agencies. And then in 2014, Bianca founded the Open Data Institute Toronto. She's a columnist, guest lecturer, and speaker on open government and public sector technology policy, and she's also a member of the Toronto Public Libraries Innovation Council. Over to you, Bianca.
Thank you. Thanks for that. Yeah, mostly excited to talking with everybody, so I'm going to keep it short, but I think probably the fastest way to locate what I'm thinking about with this is that coming from the open space, I think it's been about 5 years, I'm looking at Jean and Trace, about 5 years maybe, of thinking about open data. I had a moment, it's probably just over a year ago, where I remember I had one of those like, wait a second, there's a lot of things that could be done with data that I had not thought about. I came into the open government and open data space because I hoped to get more data from our governments to help us engage in public policy issues. So I was really coming at it from that perspective. But didn't look as much at what the open data business community was doing. I knew it was there, but I wasn't really thinking that much about it. Or, so there are all these different pieces of open, and I think it's this idea that there's this normative good associated with open, for me, has come crashing down in the last year. And starting to think about what it means to try to regain some control over how data is used, because in some circumstances I think we need to. And I think the power asymmetries of the actors involved in who can use data and for what are really important and have been under discussed. So I think that's kind of the where I'm coming from in this conversation is thinking, what are the responsibilities of a publisher, say? If you're publishing data, what's your responsibility to the people whose data you might be publishing? What does that look like? Or how do you, as a person who's in a data set, start to reclaim some power over how your data is used? Maybe you're okay with it being open, maybe you're not okay with it being open. We have StatsCan as a very, I think it's over 100 years old now. We have a model about our data being out in aggregate and being used, but it's not the same as corporate use of data and what that looks like. So I think those are some of the pieces that I've been thinking about. And the last piece, which I find super interesting in these times, is people talking about my data. I don't know, has anybody heard about this global organization that just launched called My Data? And it's really, really interesting because on one hand, we're having this moment of like, this is mine, and I'm going to go out and I'm going to manage it, and I'm going to say what should happen, and I'm going to declare agency and privacy. A lot of data is also fact, and it's not up to you, even though it might be about you, as to what it is. And I think this idea about what's the difference between what you can own and what is fact, it needs to inform these conversations a bit more. So I think those are some of the pieces I'm thinking about in all of this.
Okay, great. So I've got a few questions I'm going to put to the panel to kind of get us charged up and going. But before I do, I want to kind of poll the room to get a sense of who you all are. So who is a lawyer in the room? How many lawyers do we have? Okay. Who would consider themselves a data advocate of some shape or form? Okay, who's actually scraped? Okay, who has no idea what scraping really is, but you came anyway because it sounded interesting? Nobody? Everyone has some sense of familiarity with scraping. Okay, so I'm going to start with a bit of a surprise question for the panel. I want you to think back to the first time you scraped data, if you did. At least 3 of you did. Have you ever scraped before?
I'm thinking. I didn't do it myself,
I'll
but I
come
was
to you
party.
last.
I was
Okay.
party to it.
So
yeah.
for our first 3 folks who've scraped, I'd love if you can remember, if you feel comfortable sharing, or the first time you want to talk about it, what was the kind of data you scraped, and what was the driver or the impetus behind why you wanted to scrape it? Yuan, I'm going to start with you.
I want someone else to start if that's okay. Maybe.
Okay,
I
John,
would
do you
love
want to
hear
go
other
first?
Stories, yeah.
Sure. So this would have been as a doctoral student, and I was wrestling with this challenge in my project. How do I show how a blogger might be impacted based on receiving what's known as a copyright notice, so a copyright threat about content that blogger had posted online? How can I show this notion of a chilling effect, right? It's a real methodological problem. How do you show that someone would have said something or done something but for they received some threat or became aware of some government data collection or surveillance, something like that? This is something I was wrestling more generally in my project. And one thought that occurred to me in some of the practical training that I had during the doctoral studies, where they had courses on Python, and there were collaborators that helped. But one was to basically scrape some information on you had bloggers that had received copyright notices. The idea was that maybe collect information about the number of posts that a blogger might have done before and after receiving that notice. Was there a decrease? Was there a change in the kinds of information or subject matter that they were covering in their postings? And that was simply a very simple program that scraped from HTML public posts and just counted and tabulated the frequency of posting before and after. Very simple. I'm sure many of you who do this are not at all impressed by that example, but it was my first time, guys. So that was the beginning of my journey, I guess, in this space.
Okay. Max, you okay to go
Sure,
next?
yeah. I'll talk about this example. So in my work, I often get asked by journalists to scrape things, but this particular example I want to talk about because it's the first one I worked on where I actually did like a project for myself here. So it's sort of recent. This is during the Ontario provincial election, but what I wanted to do was find some way to analyze the press releases from the different parties. So I built a scraper that would download the press release data set from each provincial party. So it's not a huge data set, really. There's a few hundred press releases. It's debatable whether I even needed a scraper to do this, but ultimately I wanted to look at the text there and see if there's any interesting topics or trends. So I tried a few different machine learning analyses and topic modeling analysis. It didn't really yield anything interesting, so I finally just started to look at the words themselves. What are the words that are being used? And I noticed, I looked at the words of the different parties, and I found that just the word NDP was not being used at all by either the Liberals or the PCs until a very specific point in the campaign. And this is the point when the NDP started to rise in the polls. And I found that once they rose in the polls, the number of mentions of the word NDP just went up like dramatically. So from that, we were able to do a fairly simple story just showing how the attention shifted by the PCs and the Liberals towards the NDP as they began to rise in the polls. And this is a story that could have been told without scraping, but I do think that the data component of it added an extra element to the story, because it's one thing just to talk about a shift in rhetoric, but it's another thing to actually show that shift and visualize it even. And I think that can add more validity to a story, which is something that people are always looking to do in the news space.
Great. Yuan, do we have?
Yeah, so I think that my data scraping experience has been marked by analog technology more so, insofar as it's been me doing it manually. I'm still learning the skills to use Python, for example, a language that some of you might be aware of is often used for scraping. And so as I'm developing those skills, I wonder what data scraping, how narrow or broadly that's defined. Because as a law student, I would have scoured the web for for instances of a certain case word being mentioned, or a certain legal reason, or a certain topic being mentioned, and then by collating that, I think that could constitute data scraping, and so I think it's worthwhile to see previous uses of this term as it exists before we can imagine it being automated. Where I'm finding myself using it more now, that is the tool of data scraping, is explorations that I'm doing with a friend where we're actually trying to use DNS intelligence, so domain name information, subdomain information as it relates to publicly accessible information that companies and entities don't realize is online about them when you use a tool like Python to use the command line and to find out what do they have online that they don't realize is online. And by realizing that, for example, one website has there are a lot of resources online, you go to that subdomain at points, and you can actually see who's been editing documents. You can see are they anonymous, even though they've been ostensibly anonymous in other ways. So that's where I'm exploring the use of data scraping now. I'd like to talk about one more thing that I'm not doing, but that a friend of mine is doing, and he actually researches the sort of he researches trust in the dark web. And so what he does is he uses scraping constantly at UDM where I work to look at how people review other people on the dark web, whether or not they represent as woman or man, and to see how that impacts the trust level that they gain. So I think that that's a sort of range of uses of data scraping that range from normal to interesting to sexy, and then therefore is really a good range of how this occurs in everyday life.
Yeah, okay. Bianca?
Yeah, so for me it was a story related to shelter usage in the city of Toronto. Social planning Toronto, is there a social planning Ottawa? Just you ring a bell? Somebody know? Yeah, social planning councils, looking around, right? So there's a part of the background for me from open data was going to people and saying what data would be really helpful for you to get if I could help you get it. And so I found out from the social planning Toronto that to get the shelter usage for Toronto's shelters, there was a website, and on Tuesday it would publish Monday's shelter usage, and on Wednesday it would publish Tuesday's shelter usage, and there was no persistent data set. It was only the one day, and that one number was available. So all of these researchers had it as part of their workflow that they would go to that page, pull that number down, go back and do their work. And I think it's important to know both how small and how big this problem is, right? So you hear that and you think, wow, that's what they're doing. And so a friend of mine helped me understand that problem, and then William Wolf Wylie, who's a what do we call it, data journalist, was able to pull a scraper together. And so it became this spreadsheet where he wrote the scraper, pulled that, and then had this persistent record, and it was just a shared document, which would break when the city would, of course, change how the page was structured. But I think the two really important points that came out of this story, one of them was that once that data was out in public, people who really, really knew about the housing crisis got even more nervous. Because if you don't understand how those numbers are arrived at, then people are like, oh, it's fine, it's 88% full, or it's 92, or it's 96, or whatever. And you look at it, it's not that bad. And it just went to sort of reinforce the fact that if you don't know how those numbers are arrived at, this data out there on its own is quite dangerous. And I think this is a really important point of any open data or any data that you would pull on a website. But the other point to me that was interesting was that, and I've seen this from day one with the open data community, I was like, how much does this data matter to this group that they haven't spent the cycles to be, chasing the city down and be like, this is ridiculous. Why aren't you just giving us this data? So you think about what hard work they're actually doing, that something this stupid isn't even on their task list. You think about how broken all of these systems are. If this is critical data for them, why are they having to do these cartwheels? But then also they're doing way bigger pieces of work. So it was a really good, process to go through that whole thing to see what was broken, and then also why it was dangerous to even have it out, because the way the city arrived at those numbers, yeah.
Okay, open question to the panel. The subtitle of our session today was "The Data You Want But You Can't Have." Examples of the data you want that you can't have, and what is it about that data that's so alluring? You don't have to go in order, so you can just pop it out.
get any data from the government that would be truthful about how they're making decisions.
Okay.
That would be a good start. I'd
Here's a
love
big
that.
bucket, Treasury
Yeah,
Board
like-
Secretariat.
Yeah, that'd be helpful.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah.
Max, you look like you're, go.
I don't know. I really like data on housing prices, specifically, like sold data. So I know like the Toronto Real Estate Board, there's a big high-profile Supreme Court case where they ended up having to release this data, but it's not released to the public. It's released to people who have license to use it. So I can't scrape that data, and I wish I could. I could think of lots of fun stuff to do with that.
What would you do with it if you could?
Okay, you could do all sorts of things. You could build a tool that would show you, you could cross-reference it with commuting time data, and then you could see, okay, well, how far, if I live an hour away from Toronto, for example, how much would my house cost? If I lived an hour and a half, how much cheaper would it be? Or you could also look at the impact of a housing development on the property values around it. So this whole idea like where you have property, if you add add to the supply of property, it's going to bring down the prices. But if you could actually look at a specific property, a specific condo, and see how that impacts it. So it's a couple
Okay,
things.
great.
I think a lot of the data that I want isn't data because it's probably not, it's too qualitative to have been passed down through the form of data, and you'd have to analyze it. But some data that I would love to have access to is companies, particularly those based in Canada and the US, that offer censorship surveillance tools sold to countries that are committing human rights abuses around the world. I would love to know that.
Okay. John, do you have a...
I'd love to know that too.
Yeah, okay. Yeah.
And I certainly support Bianca's bid for more government data. I'm on board with that too. So look, there's agreement on the panel right away. For me, I mean, there's a range of different kinds of data about government data collection, surveillance programs that I'd love to know for my own just personal interest, but research. But one area I think that's becoming really interesting and challenging for a host of reasons, especially on social media platforms that often where you have web scraping and data scraping, is content moderation. And dealing with issues of illegal content, hate speech, disinformation now, this notion of fake news, and how a lot of these companies now are automating that process. But it's very much a black box as to the kinds of how is user input used to make decisions about content online. How is information on their side, are they doing scraping? Are they doing web crawling, and how is that information fed into their decision-making process? So information about that black box, about their own algorithms. So it's great to have that data and analyze it in light of other kinds of data, in light of qualitative information, speaking to people, victims of online harassment, online cyberbullying, how they've been targeted, and case studies with rich data from inside these platforms about how these challenges are dealt with. I'd love to have that information. I think it would be really fascinating, but also important from a public interest perspective.
So this thread of public interest is running through here. I would say that one of the most common conversations, it feels like data privacy has exploded in terms of popular and public media attention, but also just everyday awareness. I'm curious from you as a panel of 4 people who've been thinking about privacy issues for a good long time in different contexts, what are some of the most pressing privacy-related issues that emerge from the practice of scraping? So both in terms of opportunities and constraints and things that you're concerned about. Anyone have something you can think of? John, go ahead. Yeah.
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, for me, issues of privacy when it comes to data scraping and web scraping, I think really highlight a need for us to generally, as a society, as researchers, as lawyers, as data activists, but also as a society, especially in North America and Canada and the US, I think, to think differently about privacy issues. And what I mean by that is, I think in Canada, and certainly in the United States, we're influenced by a certain conceptualization of privacy. Right? The notion that privacy is tied to only interests of seclusion, this notion of being left alone. That famous article published by Warren and Brandeis in 1890, The Right to Privacy, in the Harvard Law Review, I think it's had a real significant influence on how we think about privacy and privacy law, policy, and norms. But what that means is if we conceptualize privacy only in that way, then issues of data scraping, of issues of web scraping, and the privacy concerns that come out of that forces us to rethink that notion of privacy and to think more about privacy in public. Now, this is something that legal scholars, privacy theorists probably have been talking about for a while, but in their only disciplinary silos. I think we also have to engage more as researchers and as activists with policymakers and with the general public to start rethinking privacy in public. I think, for example, to contrast the North American privacy tradition with the European one, which is much more focused around notions of data protection, that is concerns about reputation. Reputation is a public concept. It's about my standing within a community, and how data and information might impact their reputation. So that's why today Europe is really leading in the space of, I think, public privacy norms through new initiatives like the GDPR, which is, I think, an important improvement but not a perfect solution. But I think the reason being is that they have a different conceptualization of privacy that we need to learn more, share more, and rethink our own way of approaching these issues.
Anyone else? Privacy?
Right.
Nibbles?
I'm like, yeah, I'm not a privacy background person at all. So it's funny, I've been trying to talk about things, people are like, oh, you're a privacy advocate. I'm like, actually, I'm not a privacy advocate. I'm glad that there are so many, but I think that privacy becomes the word we grab at when we mean a lot of other things too. So I completely, agree with what you're saying. I think that the issue that's come up clearly to me is how do you even think about privacy when you don't know what anybody knows about you anymore? Like I think Teresa wrote something. Teresa's blog is always the place to go. Anytime you search something, there's a Teresa blog post, and this was one about credit bureaus. And I think it's such a good example where, like, you know what they know, and you know what they know, and you kind of know what's known about it, about yourself, and you can clear it or understand it. Whereas now, how do you even manage this concept when you don't know what other people know about you anymore? Like, I don't think that's an untrue part of this problem. Like, I think there's something in there that even though you might think that, okay, people know what I like or what I don't like or what I wear or where I go or whatever, you might think that you know what they know, but I don't think we know what other people know. And so that feels like it's breaking some of the pieces of what we used to think about privacy. But I don't know, maybe that's not even true. Like, maybe people who have studied this for a long time would argue that that's not right, but that seems to be a problem that feels like it's out there.
Max, do you want to jump in? Go ahead.
Sure. I mean, yeah, like I wouldn't have much to add here, but I just know, like, in journalism, you're always concerned about public trust and people's trust in you as a news organization. So something I think about whenever I'm like scraping data, it's like, well, even if I'm legally allowed to scrape it and ethically allowed to scrape it, like, is there some sort of unwritten or unstated privacy norm that I'm flouting? Mm-hmm. And I wouldn't want to do that. Mm-hmm. So.
Has anyone on the panel ever come close to that, in that thin line between temptation and trying to uphold the public trust? Have you pulled yourself back? Where you've been like, I actually shouldn't do that because any data you were tempted to scrape but then decided not to? Maybe you don't want to talk about that. We'll leave that one. Yeah, okay. So I want to go back. In Bianca's introduction, you talked about power asymmetries. And Max, as a journalist, your work is working on behalf of the public trust. So in a way, I think journalists are trying to push back on power asymmetry. But have we reached the point in the landscape of data where data scraping is just a necessary tool in order to keep the public good, or to advocate for civil rights, or to kind of do the good work of upholding the public trust? Is this just a necessary thing?
I don't think so. Like, I think it's such a twiddling at the edges of any real problem.
Okay.
Like, it might feel nice to think that, that's really, if only we had more of this data in an easy to access way, we wouldn't be having structural racism problems in our institutions. That's not the problem, right? So I think for me, a lot of these words right now, they're getting whipped around in places where it's like the ethics of this. I'm like, that's not the ethics of AI. I'm like, that's racism. Like, it's like, we can't like subdivide stuff into these smaller issues now and think twiddling around in these legal or whatever concepts are going to address big structural things. So I would argue that this is not, to me, there's way more to be lost in publishing stuff in an open normative way when there's a power asymmetry than there is to be gained. But I'm not sure that that's right.
Okay. Anyone else? Thinking about your
I have some thoughts on that, and I think it's drawing on the work of Gabriella Coleman, a hacker scholar who I do work with, who's written about the need for what she calls a public interest hack to become a norm, where we see governments, corporations operating in secret, and how this is sort of a necessary solution that is, sort of like external whistleblower, which is a new and unprecedented thing, coming from the outside and hacking data and then releasing it in the public interest. And I would argue that, pragmatically speaking, that might be a norm because of the secretive nature of corporate actors as well as government actors. And to connect this to the other question of privacy, it seems to me that a problem of privacy as it relates to data scraping is whose responsibility is it to protect their privacy? I do conceive of this as a sort of communitarian issue more than I do an individual issue. And in both the hacking realm as it relates to, and in the data scraping world, you see that it's the responsibility of the individual to protect their privacy, to protect their information, and I lean more towards it being a responsibility of the government, who should require of corporations and organizations strong protective measures, strong transparency measures, rather than it being a matter of an individual who hacks or individual who protects himself, and let's say from like the Facebook overlords, for example. So, yeah, I think it's a necessary thing.
So, go ahead, Jon.
Can we just add to that? Actually, to come back to your earlier question, I actually did have one example of data. It wasn't so much that we were about to do it and we pulled ourselves back, but in the current project that we're working on, where we are using some information that we collect and scrape from Twitter, one of the real challenges with that project has been coming up with a model where we can really respect the informed consent of users, and that involved creating, and this wasn't me, this was one of my colleagues, he does computational social science, but we created essentially an automated tool that provides informed consent at the back end, and that allows the user to say, okay, we're doing the study, here are the aims, here's what we've gathered, it's public, but we still wanted your consent, and that's done at the back end. So that was something that took a lot of time to set up, but we were really happy with the results and how it balances the needs for research along with respect for users. But just to come back to the last question, I completely agree with Yuan. I think that when we're thinking through sort of public interest issues, thinking through data issues, and I guess I also agree with Bianca, there's this tendency towards us, always thinking we've got a new emerging practice of data scraping. We've got a new tool that's AI enforced or big data driven, that it's a new and shiny sort of tool. And each discipline sort of takes this tool and goes off and studies it in their own silo. And I think the key way in which we can lead to a better public interest solution is to be interdisciplinary, so think outside of our silos, but at the same time think through how have we dealt with these challenges in the past, how has the public interest been defined and addressed with past new technologies, past data related practices. And I think this really goes back to Yuan's good point earlier, is that why do we think of data scraping as only as something in relation to Python scripting and scraping up the web? The reality is we've done data scraping for decades. Mm-hmm. It's just been through more manual means in other information sources, and you can see artifacts of that in the PIPEDA, the kinds of exceptions of publicly available information. It's a publication, it's a telephone directory, it's a professional directory, it's a business directory, the old databases of the past. So we have dealt with these problems. So let's go back to how we define public interest and came to a good solution, not reinventing the wheel with every new technology and practice that comes along.
Yeah, and I think one of the things that I get concerned about with hacking the government's data, or whatever, scraping the government's data, not hacking, no, scraping government data, is that I think in this idea that there needs to be this transparency, what we've seen in the last 10 years at least, and probably much longer, is that data is politicized, and there will not be open data published like a free-for-all, right? Like, we've had time to do that. The governments aren't doing that. They're not doing it in Canada, never mind anywhere else. And so what I get a little worried about is that if we're pushing for this transparency all the time, for what is generally a tiny percent of the population, if that's going to push government to writing things down less, to keeping, this is what I would do. I would stop writing. I mean, I get emails, I'm like, wow, you're writing that down. Okay, that's good that you're still writing it down. But I think the other side of this that might be better to explore historically, and this may be me and my nostalgia for the state, but is trust that the bureaucracy should have a whole bunch of data that we shouldn't, and that's okay. And that we trust them with that data, and that we understand why they make decisions. And that needs to be what is more public at some meta level, but not that all the ingredients need to be out in the public realm. And I think that's where I'm a little nervous with the way this arc of the normative good of open goes, is that it's starting to break where I think a lot of the people who would look at that data 40 hours a week, that's who should have it in a lot of the cases. And not blind trust in it, but, you know, like something in here, I get worried that we're forgetting what that whole picture could look like.
Do you think, collectively or individually, is it time for us to have a new civic conversation about what the public good is with regard to data? Because we do have this narrative about open government is open, transparent, and accessible, but there are both pros and cons to making things more open. And in the spirit of the data scraping that's happening here, all the examples that you've given are all in, you know, the broad tent of what we would call public interest. But you know, is our notion of public interest, first of all, say nostalgic? You know, if we look at who's in the room and who's on the panel, you know, who's preoccupied with this? Do our conceptions of the public good represent the actual public's perception of what the public good is? Mm-hmm. Do we need to be wiser and smarter and more nuanced about what our understanding is of the public good? Like, is this an important civic conversation, do you think, right now?
Yeah, and I think getting it out of the data is leaky. The data is either going to be there, it's not. It's the usage. It's what's the public good usage of that data. Because right now we're in this free-for-all where you just dump it all out there and then you go, right? Like, I hope that nothing nefarious is happening with my data so that some good people could maybe also use it. Like, this is not a sound, way to go forward. And I don't think trying to control the data I don't think we can walk this back at this point. You know, I don't think by the leakiness and the replicability of data that we need to be thinking about the data. I think we need to think about use and what is a public good use look like, and then you can also control what it isn't and what happens when you do something that you shouldn't do with it. So I think that might be the way.
Anyone else want to jump in?
Sure.
Max,
Yeah. Well, I think a big part of this is transparency too. Just being more transparent in how you're accessing the data and how you're using it can go a long way to boosting everyone's understanding on all sides of the issue. And I think having a good set of ethical standards can go a long way towards that. I had a good chat with a friend of mine at the CBC who was explaining to me about his ethical standards for scraping, and these are actually part of the CBC standards and practices. And there's some great stuff there, like IDing yourself whenever you send a request, giving your contact information, only scraping if you have to, asking permission if need be, or just taking precautions not to harm their systems. And I just was contrasting this with the documentation on a popular scraping library that I use, where the best practices are basically just don't get blocked. So it's like, when you look at that, I think there's definitely a disconnect there with the kind of tools that are out there and how they're promoted to be used. It's almost like there's this kind of hackery nature there. Even the sound like scraping or like building a spider with Python to crawl a site, it all just sounds kind of like vaguely illicit. And I just think like if somehow like that we talked more about the like transparent, we were a bit more transparent and a bit less like hackery about this whole thing, it would go a long way towards improving understanding.
Okay.
So my answer to that question is both hopeful and cynical. I think that I was reading about examples of data scraping in Canada. There was just recently a class action that was certified in Newfoundland against a company named Afterlife.com. that calls into question what public interest and public good means when the ethicalness of the service being offered is really gray. And this company decided to scrape obituaries, put them on a website, and then monetize the collection of these obituaries by offering people the ability to buy flowers and send thank you or condolences cards to people whose family and friends have died, which is really sad and tragic. And I think that is a great example of how public interest as a term and public good have been weaponized, monetized by for-profit actors who say that we're offering a service even though you never asked for it. And I'd like to think, though, in spite of the privatization of services that should or have been offered by the state, that there does exist a public good, because if we eradicate and just completely obliterate the notion of public good or public interest that is separate from private, interest in the interest of those who are vulnerable, then where are we? So I think that the afterlife example is a great example of, I don't know what that means and can companies use it, but I want there to be this notion, and I remain hopeful that that exists, particularly when I see the actions and work of people like civil servant, which is what you're involved with, because I want there to be a notion of things that should benefit the whole, even though it's really gray.
So before I go to Jon, I'm going to warn the audience. After Jon answers this, I'm going to open up the floor to all of you to start asking questions. So start to get ready. Okay, Jon, do you want to talk to this public good question?
Sure. So I agree. I think it makes a lot of sense to have a new conversation about defining public good in this context for a few reasons. The first is, I think if we do have a broader public conversation, I think it means that government and policymakers will start taking the issue more seriously and engage more directly in more evidence-based. And Bianca's laughing at me, but there's my optimism on this count.
I love it.
And maybe as part of the benefit there is, I think, a more broader and engaged public conversation can start to dispel some misconceptions that the general public and also policymakers, I think, have in this context about people's understanding of data and their expectations surrounding it. So, for example, and I was, talking with Bianca and Amanda Clark in the audience, who does a lot of research in the space for this panel. And one example of this, for example, is there's an expectation or assumption amongst the public that young people don't care, for example, about privacy. They're more open to sharing data. The digital natives, if you will, this concept. But as the social science has been done, it's shown that that's actually not true at all. In fact, younger people also clearly care about privacy. Research done by people like Dana Boyd have demonstrated this. The key is how you articulate those privacy norms. Discourse surrounding surveillance and other kinds of norms speak more to the younger generation than maybe privacy, which is something that's more familiar to older generations. So I think by having that kind of a conversation where we move out of silos of just privacy, we speak to other kinds of discourse, other kinds of research disciplines, and we speak across disciplines, not merely within them, I think you dispel some of those misconceptions. And thirdly, and I agree entirely with this idea of being less hackery, associating this with Python and scripting, and that's sort of part of what I tried to get across, maybe not as clear in my earlier point, that this notion of the public good, public interest surrounding data practices, it's not something new. We've dealt with this challenge in the past, and if we can think through some of the historical case studies, we can show that it's not a scary problem. It's something we've handled before, and I think that's another way to make it more familiar and an easier way to engage the public on these questions.
Do you want to jump in, Bianca?
Yeah, it's
Go.
perfect. I just think these universal terms are not helping us anymore. Like that there's any normative good about anything, open, democracy, public good. Like you can have heard that your whole life and have seen nothing for yourself in it. So how can you defend this language? To me is it's not helpful anymore. It's not cynical. It's that we need to be more precise about what these things mean. I know we need an umbrella, but I think that all of these terms now at this point in where we are in history and in politics and all of it, it's every time there's a universal term, I'm beginning to realize that's the heart of a problem. Like every time you think you're saying something and someone else is saying something and you're not saying the same thing, you have a problem. And these ones really seem to pop up in all of these discussions. Ethics, like, yeah, there's a lot there. So that's what I was going to say.
Okay, I'm gonna open it up to the floor. Who's got a question? Okay, I'll go to you first.
Yeah, my name is John Anderson. I haven't written anything on data scraping. I've maybe written about regulating Netflix, Facebook, and Google in Canada. So my question is, what do you think about the fact that we seem to be in a particular universe right now where we have networks and social media, the mechanisms themselves, which most people use to communicate. And like my son everything is through Facebook, etc. And those companies are not regulated, and they do constant data scraping. They do data scraping, and we've seen the worst examples of that in the elections, American elections, but and people who bought the data from them. But they do regular data scraping all the time. You get ads. That's data scraping where they're down to an ad targeted at a part of the Facebook group or a part of the Google constituency. You get the ads whether you want them or not, and they control that, and they've found a way to financialize this data scraping in a massive way, but also control the mechanisms that most people are getting their information. And to me, that is something which is different from the past. In the past, we had that, but we didn't have such a tight control, a tighter and tighter control of the mechanisms through which people communicate, and they're not regulated.
Okay, anyone want to take that up?
I think that's like a hugely important point. Like from a scraping perspective, like it's a lot harder to scrape data when it's on these like huge, big closed platforms. Like you actually can't scrape Facebook data. Like it will detect that you're a bot, and it will prevent you from doing that. So I wonder. I'm curious what you guys have to say. If that to me seems like a bigger issue, like having all this data just in the hands of one big corporation, than like the dangers of people scraping. Because I've noticed a lot of these companies are starting to put in their terms of service, don't scrape. Like you're forbidden from scraping, and obviously they can do all the same things with the data that a potentially nefarious user could do by scraping it. So, but they're preventing the potentially beneficial uses by researchers or journalists or whatever. So I think that it's probably, in my mind, a bigger issue than like just people scraping sites out there. But I could be wrong.
Anyone want to jump in?
No, I think Max has brought up some great points. I mean, I think several people in the audience here could say that these companies are regulated. I mean, it's not a free for all. Like they're not operating it completely illegally. I think some of what they're doing are things that we haven't. That, to your point, I think are different than when than maybe when some of the laws were formed. So I think it's that gap between when a law is written and the state of play, and then what happens as time passes and new things are happening that the law doesn't really have space for. Like I think the issues with some of the companies that you mentioned are that those are the big five. Like this is the power asymmetry problem as well, is that they have all that data. What one more data set means to them is a totally different animal than what it means for me to get a second data set with my first one. So I think that's another factor that just pushes me to usage in what you're saying. I'm not sure how helpful that is, but that's what you prompted me to think about.
I'm going to go to Tracy now. Go ahead, Tracy.
Does fair use help us here? So the concept of fair use, or fair use in an academic institution to copy things because you're going to do it for educational purposes. So most of the examples that the panel's provided to me have been examples of fair use, but I'm not an expert in the law, and there's a whole bunch of them.
Yeah, exactly.
A couple up here.
Yeah.
What would fair use look like in this context in terms of, it gets away from public good, it gets into a concept that exists that we know.
Yeah, and what I wonder about with regulation as well is and fair use, I suppose, is I kind of keep going back to the fact that we have the Privacy Act and PIPEDA or PIPEDA, I hear people say it both ways, like that we have this fundamentally different take on what's government held data versus what's, corporate, private sector. and that kind of helped us in the formulation of how that was. And I'm not sure how fair use sits in that, you know, like something, I'm not sure where it sits in those two, because I keep thinking that in Canada, the fact that we have that division is helpful. Like with GDPR, with other places where it doesn't exist. It's one law for all of the data. Like I think keeping private, like commercial interest and public service use interest separate is helpful, to my brain at least. But I also think with fair use is like fair use says who, and this gets to the point for me about what I might want to have done with my data for free, or I could let you do it and I'm fine with it. Maybe John would want money for, you know, maybe Max wouldn't want to have it happen at all. Like, and I think it's that definition again gets me stuck of like how do we define what the fair use part is, and it's also because I don't work with that term enough. It doesn't like.
There is a legal construct of fair use, right? So does someone have the legal construct of fair use?
Right, so you're speaking of fair use for dealing in the copyright context? I gather.
So I'm page scraping for the public good.
Sure.
I'm not reselling, I'm not marketing, but I'm doing the homelessness analysis, looking at market prices for housing, let's say, for real estate.
For sure. So certainly one of the legal dimensions of the problem that still needs to be worked out when it comes to the legality of data scraping and web scraping is copyright. So that's one of a number of different legal challenges. Others are terms of service. Others are maybe trespass to chattel. That's been argued in court, dismissed, but it's certainly been accepted in the United States.
What's trespass to chattel?
It's essentially a tort where you bring against someone, you sue someone for interfering with your personal possessions, so personal property.
Okay.
It's more physical interference. It's more for the physical realm, but it's been argued in the digital context as well. So with copyright, absolutely. Copyright becomes obviously an issue here because if you're downloading data or scraping content from somebody else's website, there may be copyright interest in that content, and if you are reproducing it without permission, that raises copyright issues. In Canada, we have a concept known as fair dealing. It's similar to the American concept of fair use. Both of them, the way the Supreme Court of Canada has interpreted this concept, the factors are similar in terms of what's taken into account. But even here, certainly some of the factors that you mentioned. So if I'm an academic researcher doing work that's, I believe, in the public interest, and I'm not doing it for commercial reasons, for example, that's going to be something that if I am sued for copyright infringement, I can raise as part of a fair dealing defense. The challenge is that fair use and fair dealing are both notoriously vague concepts to the extent that it's always difficult to know in any given context as to whether what you're doing certainly is legal and authorized. I would say the way the Supreme Court of Canada has been interpreting fair use, it's been interpreting it generously, broadly. I agree with that interpretation. But more clarity, I think, with some of these practices would be helpful. But if you're doing public interest research as an academic researcher, your protections are going to be much stronger than a commercial entity that's simply doing scraping for commercial and corporate reasons, which is often what ends up in court. Different corporate entities battling it out, a media platform like LinkedIn suing some scraper entity that's simply trying to pull information for their own commercial purposes.
But then the actors in this case become the publisher, not the person who's in the data.
Yeah.
Right?
Yes.
So this is where these things fall apart to me, is because even if you tell me what you're doing is in the public good or interest, I could look at your research and be like, no, it's not, and you're doing it with my information. And that now we're totally missing each other on this tool, right? So yeah, that's a problem.
Okay, I promise. Go ahead. Yeah.
Hi, it's Peter Timmons again. I was just going to comment on the difference between personal data, say like, what's my favorite color? Did I stay at a women's shelter last night? Compared to public data, like how long are the sewer pipes in my neighborhood, right? And there's definitely a very clear that's public data, why would you hide it? That's personal data, I would hide it. But my question concerns data. Like data in my business is measuring something, and you might have a good measure or a bad measure, and then you're processing it, you're analyzing it, you're scraping it from some other place, you're taking it there, and you're publishing it in a study or something. But how do you know the quality of it? Because I'm going to do some commenting about the quality of survey data, which is like how much variance it has, compared to administrative data, compared to, well, how much is missing? You didn't fill in your tax form. We need your tax data, but it's missing. Compared to big data, which is the question I'm sort of bringing here, or scrape data, what's a quality measure of it? Like, how do you know? You could scrape 10,000 tweets, oh wow, but is that really useful? Like, can you scrape out sentiment from that or whatever? Thanks.
Yeah, I'm talking a lot. So
No, I feel like you're
well, just your
you're
first.
ready to answer this.
Well, your first thing about the pipe, like my immediately, and I'll get to the quantitative one, but I tried to find out about lead pipes in Toronto, and there isn't a database of all the lead pipes versus the non-lead versus the replaced pipes. And even that piece of information, if you knew all the people who had been drinking water from lead pipes and all the people who hadn't, and you were doing some kind of insurance or health thing or whatever, this to me is the way that these things don't matter independently anymore. Like, it matters to know, even though it seems like that would be fairly maybe who cares public data, but then you just take one step into application, and then I think it matters that that's public or not. Do you know what I mean? Like, I feel, it's just that the premise that these things independently are public and have no consequence to individuals, I think is where I'm starting to struggle with, like, what is ever safe to to put out independently, and I don't know. Like, and that to me feels like a function of the last 20 years more so than maybe before that. That was the thing that was making me respond in terms of quantifying what's good, bad, or, you know, I always think about what's a good sample size, 200, right? Like, I always think about the one thing I remember from science about that, but I don't know, like, are there number stuff that you think about? Yeah.
I mean, that's like such a big question. It's really important, but it's really hard to like give any specific advice, because I mean, especially for these kind of big data analyses, it's so easy to get like lost in the sophistication of the tool and to think that you're coming up with meaningful results when you're not. I think just like sticking to more simple analyses as opposed to using something that is more like mathematically sophisticated is a better way to do a gut check. Like with that press release thing, like I was doing all this sentiment analysis and stuff, and it's like I got information, but I'm like, I can't really say whether this is accurate or not. Whereas just looking at actual word counts, it's a lot less sophisticated, but at least I knew what I was getting. So, yeah.
Okay, any more questions from the audience? Yeah, go ahead.
Thanks, this is super interesting. I feel like a lot of these conversations always come down to this sense that we need to have more public conversation and a sense of like what is the public good in this space and what are people's values. So I'm wondering if you know in Canada of anyone doing that work or internationally, has anybody had this sort of conversation at a national scale? And then if not, or maybe in conjunction with answering that, like, how do you think we could do that? Are we talking about like a poll or workshops? How do we ensure an inclusive conversation? And I think John's point about just the language we use could frame it in ways that that aren't inclusive. So, you know, if you bring around privacy, then young people might give you answers that lead to certain outcomes as opposed to using the language of surveillance. And there are so many other dimensions on which we could talk about language. So I often grapple with this. It's like we do need to understand public values around these issues, but I have no idea how we could do that at scale in an inclusive enough way. Maybe that's what Teresa's grant is going to fund. I'm not sure. But
I like smart cities for this, because it's taking usages that you can point to and understand what, okay, you did that thing, there's your data trail. How do you feel about the government having that? How do you feel about your neighbors having that? How do you feel about that being monetized? How do you feel, like, is that a thing we all should know? Is that, maybe nobody wants that collected? I think that physical intervention of this smart city conversations we're having, which we are having that, you know, smart city challenge conversation, I think that's one one thing I like about what's coming out of those, that also puts us to use. Like, I don't think we can talk about this stuff anymore in the abstract. I don't think it's helpful. I really don't. I think we have to go line by line. And I think it's requiring a patience, because now we're thinking, like, we're going from open free-for-all licensing to maybe having to talk about every distinct usage that you're going to permit or not permit. And that is a lot of stuff. But that seems to be the way out of the like, I don't know what's happening with my data, is to have to go through it and, you know, everybody cough it up. What are you doing with people's data? That's one opportunity I see for the discussions.
Other thoughts about how to have this conversation?
Sure. I mean, well, I think one example we could look to, at least for some guidance, is, you know, the European process of coming up with the general data protection regulation, right? So, I mean, that is, that obviously, its foundations was the previous directive and other regulations that were in place. But it was a decade in the making, and it was a long, yes, bureaucratic process, but there was public consultations, that includes focus groups, that includes surveys. It had to be done cross-nationally. There was, government forums across, in different European centers, cities, and outlying areas. So I think, yes, it's really difficult to have that kind of a conversation. I think you've raised really nicely a lot of the challenges in doing so. But I think we might look to, the success in the formulation of the GDPR, which, as I said earlier, I think is an important improvement. It has flaws, of course, in a lot of ways. But in terms of a policy formulation process, that might be one area that we can look for guidance. In part because I think you're dealing there with different national populations. There's obviously limitations with that kind of a process, with that kind of ambitious form of regulation. But there's a reason why today we're having North American companies are falling over themselves to try to figure out what the requirements are for the GDPR if they're going to be doing business with European residents. And part of that is because Europe has been moving forward and defining the issue. And I think they've been having the conversation and we haven't. And it's hard, but I think we need to try. How's that?
I'm really optimist. Thank you.
Max, do you think about this? I mean, your craft is storytelling, right? You use data to tell stories and engage people. I think about, I like it in the New York Times when they tell the story behind the story, right? I like the ethicist there. We're nerdy. We talk about the ethicist column sometimes over coffee. Do you ever think about trying to change the way you're telling a story with the data, but are you tempted to also tell the story about the how and the why and the what behind it too? Is there space on the Global News website or on any other website or an appetite for those kinds of conversations?
I mean, definitely on the New York Times website, there's an appetite and space for that. For like at Global, usually that stuff is relegated to like a small footnote. Like I'd love to, do a whole extra post about it, but it's just you're also concerned about the time involved and whether the readers are actually going to be interested in it. But I think like it's always important whenever you do a story that involves like scraping or any kind of data analysis on public data to like explain somewhere like what did you do, just for the like aspect of if people come to you and be like, how did you get that data? You should do that.
Yuan, do you want to jump in at all on this one about how do we start to have these kinds of conversations?
I just want to say that I think Bianca has helped me think about this need to really define what we mean when we say things like public interest. It's catchy, it's cute, but I think that in your work, if you ever do figure out, if you are in the business or practice of finding out what people want or need in terms of how their data is used, it sounds like we're going to be, there's a need to be really precise, because this is exactly how we have, we avoid gaps in law and we avoid gaps in tech, is when we say, here's the if-then statement, and so grandiose definitions or uses of the word public interest or even democracy, I think, are going to be fleshed out very well and actually put into practice very well when we actually define what that means. Yeah. So I think you've helped me see that.
Nice.
So I'm going to exercise moderator influence for a second. There are a few of us in the room who are on the federal government's multi-stakeholder forum around open government, and one of the things I'm thinking about is how do we have this conversation in an ongoing way, and how do we have a natural refresh for the conversation? Because this conversation today is different than it would have been 5 years ago, and it's probably going to be a lot different 5 years from now. And so maybe as part of our democratic hygiene, to kind of take an expression from Ron Deibert and abuse it a little bit, he talks about digital hygiene, but maybe we need to build in revisiting these kinds of conversations every time we, for example, tell the world we're committed to open government. Maybe we also build in a commitment to starting to talk about what are we talking about and what do we need. Go ahead, B.
Yeah, I'm making the face. It's like the thing we have to talk about is a corporate influence on government. These discussions have been driven by economic development. They're being driven by them right now. And as long as that's the predominant narrative, everything else is going to be like scrambling. And you don't talk about data minimization, you mitigate, right? And so that's older than open data. Our government has been corporatized for the last 20 years, pretty hardcore. And so that confidence needs to be given to the politicians and to the bureaucrats that there's other stuff to push back against in these discussions. And if you don't do that, this is all going to end really badly. There's a false amount of enthusiasm right now that the data-driven economy is going to save us, that's the way out of sloth, somehow that's the magic that's going to happen. And I think we have to be very honest, even with the GDPR stuff, that if the conversation is driven from a for-profit, perspective, no, and look, that's who shows up at the roundtables, that's who is, getting in on the surveys, this language is not the language we use as people with each other we don't talk about data. If there's one thing when you, say, how are we going to talk about this, stop talking about data. Stop. We need to stop talking about data. We have to talk about the activities and the usages and the life that we're tracking and doing things with. So I just don't think we can just park the fact that that's such a dominant theme and keep going along this other track anymore. We have to bring those things together into the same conversation. And people have been saying this over the past couple of years. This is nothing new. I just don't think we've quite arrived at how to resolve that truth in these discussions.
Okay. I'm going to take one more question from the audience, and I'm going to go to Teresa. Go ahead. Yeah.
So we're talking about this as a political discussion. At the provincial, the federal, the local level, when you actually talk to politicians, you get the flashing 12 on the VCR.
It's true.
So how do you have this kind of detailed technical discussion and values discussion with people who are starting from less than zero in most cases?
Mm-hmm. I know that you don't talk to them in technical terms. You talk about transportation, you talk about healthcare, you talk about energy, you talk about how, I think the one beautiful historical thing to grab from at this moment in time is civil engineering. You used to have to ground products in science and math, and then they could be procured by the government because those were known to be sound things that could be purchased. And I think that needs to shift back into how these conversations happen, where when you roll up with your product, man, you gotta make it make sense in science language and math, not in marketing world, but in language that someone who knows about healthcare can check you and be like, no, this is good. I get what you're saying. I get what this does. Good. I'm into it. I'm a transportation planner. This is useful for me. I understand what it is. I understand how it works. I think somehow we have to shift however we're doing the pieces of that procurement into so that's how the conversations can be had. And I really think the civil engineering, there's something in the history there that I think we can borrow from. That what you were selling had to be defensible in material scientific terms. And that would be something that the public could use its dollars for because it made sense. It wasn't marketed to the government. That's one, I don't know. I think, and how do you do that? That may be very different than legal stuff. That might be standards. That might be, there's different ways to infuse those requirements in things that are being purchased. I'm talking about government procurement though. So that's the way when you were talking that I was thinking how to help. But I don't think that they should have to be talking in tech. I'm not into this thing of everybody should learn how to code or everybody needs to know all of this. To me, this is not the future. The future is that this stuff is well, it makes sense in the product and in the language that we all use already. That's, I think, what has to happen. I don't think it's talking about tech.
Anyone else want to pick that up? You good? Okay, I'm going to give the floor over to Teresa Scazza, the person who helped bring this all together and who introduced us all to each other. Teresa, do you have a few parting comments or a last question for the panel?
Yeah, I guess I was just thinking about, you go to IKEA and you see something, like a piece of furniture, and you think, yeah, I'm going to buy that. And you go to the little warehouse and it's in a box. It doesn't look like the piece that you're thinking, it's just this box. Take it home. And then you open the box and you unpack the box and you get piles of little bits and pieces and things and a set of very flimsy instructions. Before this talk, I was joking with Yuan that I often feel like my work involves making things more complicated rather than solving problems. And I think that it's because I'm spending most of my time just opening the box and putting all the bits on the table and then looking at it and going, wow, somebody's going to have to fix that. And so I think that's part of what we've been doing tonight, and it's part of what we're going to be doing tomorrow. Our workshop continues tomorrow. We're going to be kind of taking more bits out of the box and piling them up. Jon and Pam and I have 3.5 more years on this grant, and I hope that in that time we'll be able to start putting some of them together so that by the end of it we'll have something that looks like a piece of furniture or whatever that metaphor is supposed to be. But I actually also think that it's really important to sit down sometimes and take the pieces out of the box. And so I really enjoyed this discussion this evening and found it really interesting because although these are questions I think about a lot, I often think about it from kind of a narrow law perspective. And I think what happened today was that we had lots of really interesting questions and lots of really interesting answers which started to unpack, make more complicated this whole issue of data scraping. And of course, as I was sitting there, I was thinking, and of course this is what is also being called text and data mining, and the government, now that this is a thing with lots of money behind it, the government is actually going to start turning its attention towards creating a copyright exception for text and data mining, and we're going to see something that is actually going to have an impact in the data scraping world, but although the focus is going to be on text and data mining and artificial intelligence. So I think that you've all given us a lot to think about, and a lot to think about from a variety of different perspectives. Very grateful for that, very grateful for all of you to come out to this discussion and free-form discussion to participate in it. Jon, Pam, and I are going to be around for the next 3.5 years working on this. You know us, you know how to find us. If you have thoughts, ideas that you want to share, things you want to tell us about, by all means, look us up. And thank you again, everybody, for coming and listening and participating, and to our panelists as well. Thank you so much. I really enjoyed it.